I remember dying, warm and content, surrounded by my children and my husband Julian Cross, after a lifetime of building an empire from nothing but numbers and code. And then I opened my eyes, and I was 17 again, standing in a shabby welfare office with my younger sister Meredith, gripping our caseworkers' clipboard, and making a choice that would unravel everything. In my first life, the adoption agency gave us two options: the Ashford family, a global energy dynasty whose name commanded boardrooms and governments, or the Cross household, a quiet, struggling couple with a brilliant son named Julian, who survived on scholarships and secondhand textbooks. Meredith chose the Ashfords without a heartbeat of hesitation. She looked at me with those sharp, hungry eyes and whispered, "You take the boring one, Livia." "No, Sarah, you take the boring one. I'm meant for greatness." 3 years later, the Ashfords cast her out. I never learned the full story, only that she tried to manipulate their biological son Kian into a marriage alliance before she turned 18. They exiled her with nothing, and she died on the cold streets of Avalon City before she turned 21. Meanwhile, I worked 3 jobs to help the Cross family pay rent. I graduated top of my class. I earned a full ride to Westgate University, where Julian and I fell in love over late nights debugging neural networks and arguing about machine ethics. I became the most sought-after AI architect in the hemisphere. Julian and I married. We had 2 daughters, and I fell asleep every night knowing I had built my happiness brick by brick. Then, I woke up 17 again, and Meredith was already moving. She threw herself into Julian's arms before I could even process the fluorescent lights of the welfare office. She was calling his name in a syrupy voice. She grabbed the Cross parents' hands and fixed me with a smile that dripped venom. "Sarah, darling, you can have the Ashfords. I did it last time and it was brutal. You deserve a taste of palace life. I'll take care of Julian and the family here." I looked at Julian, my husband in another lifetime, praying for some flicker of recognition. But he just gathered Meredith protectively behind him, his dark eyes flat and suspicious as he stared at me. "Stay away from my sister." I took a breath and walked toward the Ashford representative, a silver-haired man in a tailored suit waiting beside a car that cost more than the Cross family apartment building. Meredith's gloating gaze followed me all the way. In our first life, she had practically skipped to that car. She had turned back and smiled at me while saying, "Go suffer for me, Livia. You're strong. You'll survive." This time, she ran toward the poverty she once despised, which meant she remembered everything, and she thought she had outsmarted me. She had no idea what she had just thrown away. The integration.
The Ashford estate wasn't a house. It was a compound perched on a cliff overlooking the volcanic coastline of Avalon City. Every surface was glass and steel, and the main residence was powered entirely by experimental fusion cells that the Ashford Group had patented a decade ago. The silver-haired man introduced himself as Hale, chief steward of the Ashford household. He handed me a leather portfolio as we drove through the security gates. "Miss Sarah, these are the household protocols you'll need to memorize before we arrive. The Ashford family values discretion, loyalty, and excellence. I suggest you don't speak unless spoken to during your first meeting." I opened the portfolio and skimmed 30 pages of rules, ranging from dinner etiquette to data security clearances. I closed it after 90 seconds. "Hale," I said, "I'm finished." He glanced at me in the rearview mirror, his expression shifting from skepticism to careful assessment. When we walked into the main foyer, Magnus Ashford, the patriarch, was standing beside a floor-to-ceiling holographic display tracking real-time energy futures across 6 continents. He was tall, silver-haired, and radiated the kind of authority that made presidents nervous. He turned and said, "Come here. What's your full name?" "Sarah," I replied, meeting his gaze. I was taught never to flinch. He nodded. "No need to change your first name. Take the Ashford surname. From this afternoon, you are my daughter and the heir apparent to a controlling interest in the Ashford Group." The elegant woman beside him stepped forward. "Your mother, Celeste Ashford. She will oversee your education and integration. If you need anything, ask her directly. Don't suffer in silence." Celeste took my hands in hers, and her eyes were sharp but kind. "Welcome home, Sarah." "Thank you, Mother," I said, and I meant it. Hale led me upstairs. The hallway was lined with original oil paintings, and the staircase balustrade was carved from obsidian imported from the asteroid mining colonies. My room was on the top floor, and when the door opened, I found a chamber that looked like a luxury command center. Walls that shifted color with biometric feedback, a bed that adjusted to my sleep cycle, and a window that displayed real-time views of the northern lights captured by Ashford satellites. I walked in and set my bag on the desk. Hale watched me closely, clearly expecting some reaction. "This is lovely," I said. "Thank you, Hale." He inclined his head and withdrew. The heir and the beast. I was alone for maybe 4 minutes before the door slammed open so hard it cracked the frame. A massive creature bounded toward me, a fully grown spotted hyena with a tracking collar and jaws that could crush a femur. It launched at my chest and knocked me flat on the expensive rug. I didn't scream. I went limp and let the animal sniff my throat while I slowly raised my hand to scratch behind its ragged ear. From the doorway, a young man drawled, "Why isn't it attacking you?"
Kian Ashford, the biological son and the reason Meredith had been exiled in another lifetime. He was 18, lanky but broad-shouldered, with a shock of dark hair and eyes the color of a winter storm. His knuckles were scarred and his posture screamed defensive arrogance. He had come here expecting to terrify me. I sat up, the hyena now resting its heavy head on my shoulder. This is an incredible animal. What's its name? He blinked. Troika, he said, then shook his head as if annoyed he'd answered me. I pulled a piece of dried meat from my jacket pocket. I'd grabbed it from the kitchen on my way upstairs. Troika took it gently and began chewing with single-minded focus. I spent years working with rescued predators in my previous life, I said. I know how to read them better than I know how to read people. Kian stared at me, his hostility wavering. You're not scared? I looked up at him. Ciao, Kian. I'm Sarah. And no, I'm not scared of Troika. She's just sizing me up, and I think I passed. He crossed his arms, but the corner of his mouth twitched. You're strange for an orphan. You're strange for a billionaire heir, but I won't hold it against you. He snorted, then called Troika to his side. The hyena whined, but followed him out, and I knew the first barrier had cracked. The training. The next week, Hale delivered a tablet to my room with a schedule that would have killed most teenagers. Daily intensive language immersion in Mandarin and Arabic, advanced macroeconomics with a former central bank advisor, combat conditioning with a retired special forces operative, corporate espionage detection and defense protocol allowed suite, and a suite of classes on Ashford Group operations, from the energy grid infrastructure to the AI division I had once dominated in another life. I looked at the schedule and said, when do I start? Hale smiled, a thin, approving line. Immediately, Miss Sarah. I threw myself into the walk. I woke at 4:30 every morning to run the estate perimeter with Troika pacing beside me. I spent 6 hours a day with tutors, mastering the intricacies of global energy markets and trade negotiations. By afternoon, I was in the sparring gym, learning joint locks and pressure points from a woman named Rourke, who'd once dismantled a terrorist cell with a ballpoint pen. In the evenings, I retreated to a secret project I'd been building in my private quarters, a neural network architecture I designed in my previous life and was now quietly reconstructing on a secured server I had smuggled into the Ashford network. A month later, Celeste called me into the family library. She was holding a report from my tutors. Sarah, she said, your instructors say you've completed 6 months of curriculum in 4 weeks. How is this possible? I've always learned quickly, Mother, and I don't like being unprepared. She studied my face for a long moment, then nodded. I knew I made the right decision when I agreed to bring you here. Kian is brilliant, but he's reckless. His father and I have indulged him too long. He needs someone who can keep pace with him and pull him back from the edge when necessary. She slid a folder across the desk. Inside was an analysis of a rival conglomerate, the Sterling Group, who'd been making aggressive moves on Ashford geothermal patents. I want you to review this and give me your assessment by Sunday. I took the folder and said, I'll have it ready by Friday. Celeste smiled again, and I saw something deeper than approval. It was the beginning of trust. The street and the shadow. That Saturday, Hale informed me I had a day of leave and the family driver Vance would take me into downtown Avalon City. I decided to visit the Central Arcology, a massive vertical shopping complex that served as both retail hub and social scene for the city's elite. As I stepped out of the car, I saw a familiar face near the Fountain Plaza. Meredith. She was wearing a cheap mascot costume for a noodle franchise, the oversized helmet tucked under her arm revealing a face flushed crimson from the heat. Her hair was plastered to her forehead and she was shoving flyers at unresponsive pedestrians. Then I saw Julian. He came sprinting out of a side street holding a stack of flyers and immediately began fanning Meredith with them, his face twisted with exhaustion and devotion. I heard him say, Meredith, you need water. Sit down. I'll finish the shift for you. She gave him a pale, trembling smile. No, Julian, I can push through. You have your tutoring session soon. Go, don't worry about me. In my first life, I had been the one sweating in that mascot suit while Julian studied. I had worked 4 jobs so he could focus on his engineering degree, and he had loved me for it. But now Meredith was playing the same role and draining him dry. I turned to walk into the arcology, but Meredith spotted me. Livia? No. Sarah, she called out, rushing to block my path, her eyes dropping immediately to the watch on my wrist, a gift from Celeste. You look comfortable, she said, the word dripping poison. But don't forget the Ashfords eat people like you for breakfast. You might end up in a gutter before the year is out. I tilted my head slightly and said nothing. My silence seemed to enrage her. She stepped closer, her voice rising. My parents treat me so well. Julian tutors me every night and brings me snacks. I said, Oh.
Her face twisted. Julian arrived just then, placing himself between us. "What did you do to my sister?" he demanded, his voice sharp and proprietary. I walked past him without a word and entered the arcology. Behind me, I heard Meredith's theatrical sigh. "Julian, you didn't need to be so harsh. She's still my sister." I used the allowance card Celeste had given me to purchase a series of small gifts for the household staff. A custom tablet stylus for Hale, an imported tea set for Rook, a rare book on hyena behavior for Kian. I had learned from my previous life that loyalty is built in small gestures. When I returned to the car, Vance was waiting with the trunk open, and Meredith was still standing by the fountain, staring at my purchases with pure, unfiltered hatred. The underground dive.
2 months passed. Kian and I had settled into an uneasy rhythm. He ignored me at the breakfast table, but always made sure Troika was waiting outside my door for our morning run. He mocked my combat training, but asked to spar after watching me dislocate Rourke's wrist during a drill. One evening I was in the study reviewing the Sterling threat assessment when Kian appeared in the doorway, his expression shifty. "A few classmates are doing a cave dive off the northern coast tomorrow night," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Underground, flooded passage through the basalt cliffs. It's supposed to be the most dangerous recreational dive in the hemisphere." I set down my tablet. "Who organized it?" "Some guys from the Reynard family. Why?" The name Reynard hit me like a thunderbolt. In my first life, the Reynard heir had challenged Kian to a dangerous stunt, an illegal mountain race that ended with Kian's car wrapped around a cliff face and Kian himself confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his life. I had read about it in the archives after his funeral, because in that timeline I had been Meredith, who attended his memorial service and felt nothing but a cold calculation about inheritance. "Kian, don't do it." He frowned. "Why not? It's just a dive. I've done caves before." I stood up and crossed the room until I was inches from his face. "The Reynards have been trying to undermine your family for 18 months. Their geothermal division is losing contracts to Ashford every quarter, and they just had a hostile takeover bid rejected by your father's board. If something happens to you during a dive they organized, it'll look like a tragedy, but it'll be sabotage." He stared at me, his bravado cracking. "You sound paranoid." "I'm not paranoid. I'm informed. And if you go on that dive, I'm coming with you." He laughed, but it was uncertain. "You can't even swim in open water." "I've been training in the estate pool every night for 6 weeks. I lied smoothly. "I have a rebreather certification from my previous life, and I know the basalt cave system from geological surveys Celeste gave me to study the geothermal vents." He stared at me for a long time, then shook his head. "Fine, but if you drown, I'm telling my mother it was your idea." The northern cliffs were brutal in the moonlight. We descended a rope ladder to a submerged entrance, and the water was so cold it felt like needles against my exposed skin. Kian went first, with 2 of the Reynard cousins following. The plan was to navigate the flooded tunnel, emerge in a dry cavern on the far side, and climb out through a sinkhole. Halfway through the passage, my headlamp caught a glint of something unnatural on the ceiling. Pre-placed shape charges wired to a remote trigger. I grabbed Kian's ankle and yanked him back just as the first explosion ripped through the tunnel ahead of us. The shockwave slammed us both into the rock wall, and I felt something crack in my ribcage. But I pulled him sideways into a narrow side fissure I had memorized from the survey maps. The main passage collapsed, the Reynard cousins vanished in a churn of debris and bubbles, and Kian was panicking, his rebreather mouthpiece knocked loose. I shoved my spare regulator into his mouth, held him against the fissure wall, and guided us through the secondary route for 40 agonizing minutes until we broke the surface in a tide pool half a mile down the coast. We dragged ourselves onto the black sand, coughing and bleeding. Kian rolled onto his back, staring at the stars, his chest heaving. "You saved my life." I was pressing a hand against my ribs. "Stop stating the obvious." He turned his head to look at me, water streaming from his hair, and something in his eyes had fundamentally shifted. It wasn't gratitude, it was allegiance. "The Reynards did this." "Yes," I confirmed, "and we're going to destroy them. But first, we need to survive the walk back to the estate because I think I broke a rib." He laughed, a wet, shuddering sound, and pulled me to my feet. And from that moment, we were no longer strangers sharing a surname. We were siblings, forged in fire and seawater. 3 hours later, in the Ashford Private Medical Wing, Magnus Ashford stood at the foot of my bed while a doctor wrapped my torso. His expression was the cold void of a patriarch who had just learned his son was nearly assassinated. Sarah gave him the full report, including the shaped charges and the remote trigger signature. Hale recovered the detonator frequency from the cave debris. Magnus turned to me. "The Reynard family has 24 hours to vacate their corporate holdings on the eastern seaboard. I'll see to that. But you didn't just save my son, you anticipated an assassination attempt and walked into a kill zone to prevent it." "I couldn't let him go alone," I said. "And I was his underboss before I was your daughter. That responsibility doesn't disappear." Magnus was silent for a long moment. Then he leaned down and kissed my forehead. "You are an Ashford in every way that matters, Sarah." The Rising. 2 years dissolved in a blur of growth. Kian and I became inseparable.
He stopped his reckless self-destruction and started shadowing me through strategy meetings. He learned to read balance sheets and energy grids under my guidance, and I learned how to navigate the brutal social landscape of elite air gatherings with him as my shield. I expanded my neural network project into a full-scale AI platform called Helios, designed to optimize energy distribution across continental grids. Celeste presented it to the board under my name, and within months it was generating contracts worth hundreds of millions. I also cultivated a hidden persona online, the anonymous analyst known as Flux, who leaked carefully curated financial intelligence to journalists, exposing corruption in rival conglomerates. Flux was my scalpel, and I used it to carve the Rainier family out of existence within 18 months. On my 18th birthday, Keane gave me a custom dive-watch engraved with the Ashford crest and the phrase, "You dragged me out of the dark." I put it on and didn't take it off for 5 years.
Meanwhile, Meredith and Julian were living my old nightmare. I kept tabs on them, not out of sentiment, but out of strategic awareness. Julian had dropped out of university to work full-time for Meredith's escalating demands. Designer bags, imported skincare, a boutique apartment she insisted they couldn't live without. Julian's potential, a mind that in another life had co-authored revolutionary machine learning papers, was being crushed under the weight of double shifts and credit card debt. Meredith complained constantly about everything: the smell of their building, the texture of their furniture, Julian's inability to give her the life she felt she deserved. One afternoon, I was in a cafe near the financial district reviewing a contract when Meredith walked in, dressed in obviously fake designer clothes, her makeup smeared from crying. She saw me, and her misery instantly converted to rage. "You, Sarai, you stole my life!" I didn't move. "You're walking around with Ashford money, wearing Ashford jewels, while I have to beg Julian for every scrap. You were supposed to suffer this time, not me." I set down my cup and looked her directly in the eyes. "I didn't steal anything, Meredith. You chose Julian. You chose poverty. You chose to drain him dry the same way you drained the Ashfords dry in our first life. Except this time, you don't have a mafia don to throw you out on the street. You have a kind, hard-working man who you are slowly destroying." She stumbled back as if I'd hit her. "Stay away from my family," I said, using the same words Julian had used against me 2 years ago. "And if you ever try to harm anyone I love, I will ensure you regret it in ways you cannot imagine." I left cash on the table and walked out, leaving her trembling and white-faced in the cafe. The betrayal. A year later, the Sterling Group made its move. One of our geothermal engineers flagged an anomaly. A prototype extraction drill developed in our offshore labs had been replicated almost identically by a Sterling subsidiary, and they were preparing to announce it at the annual Global Energy Summit in Avalon City. I sat in the Ashford war room with Magnus, Celeste, and Keane, reviewing the evidence. "Someone leaked the drill schematics," I said. "The original files are stored on an air-gapped server in the island lab. Only 6 people had physical access." Keane cracked his knuckles, his expression murderous. "I'll find out who and I'll handle it." "No," I said. "I'll handle it. This isn't a matter of muscle. It's a matter of intelligence. Whoever did this was paid, and the Sterling Group is going to use the summit as a stage to humiliate us. We need to turn their stage into our trap." Magnus leaned back and steepled his fingers. "What do you propose?" "We let them announce the drill," I said. "We let them present it as their own innovation. And then we reveal that the schematics they stole contain a fatal flaw that my Helios AI identified 3 months ago. A flaw I deliberately embedded in the backup files before they were stolen." Celeste blinked. "You baited a trap before you even knew the files were stolen?" I smiled coldly. "I baited the trap the day I learned Julian Cross had applied for a lab assistant position at the island facility 3 weeks ago." Julian was desperate for money. Meredith had been pressuring him even more intensely, and the Sterling Group had offered him a fortune to steal Ashford intellectual property. I had let him get the job. I had let him access the server, and I had let him steal exactly what I wanted him to steal. Keane stared at me with something approaching awe. "You've been running a counterintelligence operation for 3 weeks and you didn't tell us?" "I didn't want to worry you," I said, "and I also didn't want to risk Julian being killed before we could use him to destroy the Sterling Group." The summit. The Global Energy Summit was held in the Avalon Spire, a needle of glass and light ascending 110 floors above the city. Every major energy corporation was present, along with government regulators, international media, and a live broadcast audience of millions. Sterling Group CEO Victor Sterling took the stage with a confident smirk and unveiled his stolen prize, the Prometheus drill, capable of harnessing geothermal energy at depths previously thought impossible. He described the innovation as a Sterling original, developed in secrecy over 5 years. He thanked his brilliant engineering team, and he invited the world to witness a new era of clean energy. Then the moderator turned to me as the Ashford Group representative. I walked onto the stage in a dark blue suit, the Ashford crest pin on my lapel, and I faced Victor Sterling with the same pleasant smile I used when I was about to checkmate someone. "Mr. Sterling," I said, "your Prometheus drill is remarkably similar to a design my team at Ashford has been developing. Could you explain how you arrived at this exact engineering specification?" He puffed up. "That's absurd. Our research is entirely independent."
Then you won't mind if I ask my associate Dr. Julian Cross to join us on stage? The audience murmured. Julian walked onto the stage flanked by Ashford security. He looked pale, thin, and utterly broken, but his eyes met mine, and I saw not defiance, but surrender. I spoke into my microphone. Dr. Cross worked at the Ashford Island lab 3 weeks ago, and during his employment he copied a set of files containing our drill schematics. Was he acting on orders from Sterling Group? The tension in the auditorium was suffocating. Victor Sterling's face had gone the color of old parchment. Julian's shoulders sagged, and he spoke in a voice so quiet the entire crowd had to lean forward. Yes, he said. Sterling promised me $3 million in safe passage for my sister and me to a private estate overseas. The audience erupted. Victor Sterling tried to grab the microphone, but I held up my hand. Ladies and gentlemen, I announced, I have a secondary disclosure. The schematics Mr. Sterling received were intentionally flawed. The Prometheus drill as constructed will fail catastrophically at depths exceeding 12,000 meters. And I have here a detailed report from the International Geothermal Safety Board confirming that the operational prototype Sterling brought to this summit is a death trap.
The safety board representative, a respected third-party engineer, stood from the front row and nodded confirmation. Mr. Sterling's prototype contains a fatal harmonic resonance flaw. It would have caused a blowout within 40 seconds of activation. Victor Sterling was escorted off stage by federal regulators. Julian was taken into protective custody by Ashford security, and the live broadcast cut to commercial, but not before the entire world saw the Ashford Group expose a corporate conspiracy in real time. Backstage, I found Kian waiting for me with Troika at his side. His expression was a mixture of fierce pride and lingering shock. You just dismantled a 100-year-old energy dynasty in 15 minutes! I adjusted my cufflinks. They tried to hurt my family. Kian grinned that wild, reckless grin I'd come to love and said, You are terrifying, Sarah Ashford, and I have never been prouder to be your brother. The reckoning. Later that night, in a secured room at the Ashford estate, I sat across from Julian. He was no longer in custody. He was in a guest suite. But he was not free. Julian, I'm sorry, he started. I cut him off. You stole from my family. You sold our research to a rival conglomerate that was prepared to endanger lives with a faulty product, and you did it all for what? He broke down, his face in his hands. She said she'd leave me. She said I was a failure and that the Sterling money was the only way to prove I could take care of her. I thought if I just gave her enough, she would finally love me the way I loved her. I leaned forward. Julian, I said, you have a brilliant mind. I know this because in another life I loved you and I watched you change the world with your ideas. But in this life, you are enslaved to a woman who will never be satisfied. She is a void, a black hole that will consume everything you are and still demand more. He looked up, his face wet with tears. I know, but I can't leave her. She's my sister.
She is not your sister, I said sharply. She is a parasite who chose you because she thought you were the easier mark, and she will destroy you unless you let her go. I paused, then made my decision. The Sterling Group has collapsed, their board is facing criminal charges, and the $3 million they promised you doesn't exist. But I am offering you a different kind of redemption. You will work for Ashford Group in my AI division, under strict supervision. You will be paid a fair salary, but 90% of your income will go toward repaying the damages you caused to our intellectual property. You will live in a staff apartment on the estate, and you will have no contact with Meredith for a minimum of 10 years. He stared at me, tears still spilling, but behind them a flicker of something that might have been hope. Sarah, in our past life, you and I chose each other. I remember. He swallowed. Then I choose to stay and work for you. That woman Meredith is not the person I thought she was, and if working in your basement for 10 years is my penance, I'll take it. I stood up and walked to the door.
Julian, the basement lab has a window, and the Ashford estate has a library. You're not a prisoner. You're a man who's been given a second chance. Don't waste it. He nodded, and I left him to begin his long, slow climb back to himself. Meredith's End. 2 days later, I visited Meredith in a holding facility near the port where she had been detained after trying to flee the country with a fake passport. She was sitting on a cot wearing a gray jumpsuit, her hair limp and greasy, her eyes hollow. When she saw me, she lunged at the glass separating us. You destroyed everything! You ruined me! I said nothing for a long moment, just letting her fury bounce off the reinforced barrier. Meredith, you have been given 2 lifetimes, 2 chances to build something meaningful, and in both of them you chose to feed off other people like a leech. In the first life, the Ashfords exiled you and you died in the gutter, and in this life you were doing exactly the same thing. The only difference is that this time you dragged a good man down with you. She started screaming accusations, threats, pleas, but I turned to the facility director. She will be sent to an offshore rehabilitation facility for the next 5 years, I said. It's a former Ashford research platform converted into a treatment center. She'll receive therapy, basic education, and the opportunity to learn a trade. If she refuses, she will be transferred to a federal prison for espionage charges. Meredith's face collapsed from rage into blank terror. I walked away while she pounded her fist against the glass and screamed my name. I felt no satisfaction, only the quiet weight of a chapter finally closing. The Empire. 5 years later, I stood on the observation deck of Ashford Spire, the tallest building in Avalon City. The city light stretched below me like a circuit board of gold and silver. Magnus had officially retired last year, transferring the position of CEO to me. Kian was chief operations officer and my most trusted ally. He had grown from a reckless boy into a sharp strategic leader who still kept a hyena as his constant companion. The Helios platform now powered 47 countries. Our renewable grid technology had made fossil fuels a legacy industry, and the Ashford Group was valued at more than the GDP of several small nations. Julian Cross had become the head of my AI ethics division. His work on neural network transparency had won international awards, and he had recently married a marine biologist he met during a company retreat. No one spoke of Meredith anymore. Kian found me on the observation deck and leaned beside me against the glass railing.
International authorities intercepted her today, he said. Meredith escaped the facility 6 months ago and tried to start over in South America. She attempted to scam a local mining magnate out of his assets, but he was smarter than she anticipated. It didn't end well. I took a sip of the wine I was holding and watched the harbor lights reflect off the dark water. Some people learn, I said quietly, and some people are incapable of learning. The tragedy isn't that she failed. The tragedy is that she was given every possible tool to succeed and used every one of them as a weapon against herself. Kian produced a glass from behind his back and clinked it against mine. To the Queen of the Ashford Empire. I smiled, watching the lights flicker across the city I had saved from corporate predators and energy collapse. No, I said. To the Principessa who built her crown from code and courage instead of blood and fear, and who will spend the rest of her life making sure the light never goes out. The wind from the harbor carried the scent of salt and ozone, and somewhere far below, a hyena howled at the falling moon. And everything I had fought for, everything I had loved and lost and reclaimed, was finally at peace.